You're good.
All right. I'll read you my question. My name is Jimmy Moore, and my partner here in crime is Bryan Crook. And our question is, Jane is an outgoing and vivacious person. And give an overview of the different theories of personality in your chapter and explain to what they might attribute to Jane's personality. And then what Christian author would augment your presentation? Did God create your personality, or is it more related to your environment? All right, so what is personality? Personality is described as your emotions, sad, happy, shocked, your motives, what drives you to do everything. Are you out for the almighty dollar like this little guy is? And then your behavior. And these distinguish us from person to person, and that's what builds our personality. And there are 5 theories that we're going to talk about. The number one is, can you say psychodynamic?
He looks familiar.
Yeah, Freud. All right, and then there's the trait theory. Everybody's got traits. What am I? Am I happy, sad? Or am I a worker? You know, reply to your occupation. Learning theory. What do we do? And then humanistic existential, which is where my partner here is going to talk about all these in more detail. And sociocultural wasn't on that slide, but that's the 5th one, is socioculture.
Okay, we're going to start with the psychodynamic perspective. There are several different theories and theorists in this perspective. But each one of those theories originated with Sigmund Freud. And he teaches that the personality is characterized by conflict. And that at first that conflict is external. It's your drives of sex and aggression, and that is in superiority, come into conflict with morals and standards in the community, your own personal morals, or even laws. And at some point, those laws and those social rules are internalized, and then the conflict becomes internal. Freud believed that the human mind was like a iceberg, and that the most of everything about the mind, most of your thoughts, you weren't even really aware of, because they were under the level of the water. If you know what an iceberg, the vast majority of the iceberg is below the water level, and you don't see it. All you see is just the tip of it. Here, yes. And so what is above the water line is what he would consider to be the conscious mind, those conscious things that we're conscious of. What was below the water was pre-conscious and unconsciousness. And so he also had what he called the id, the ego, and the superego. And what was the id was made up of our primitive desires, things that we weren't even really aware of because they're unconscious things. And then the ego is that which is made up of, the ego keeps track of and helps keep the id in line. It develops in the first year of life and stands for reason and good sense. It's what helps us to deal rationally with frustrations. And it curbs the appetite of the id. The superego develops as the child begins to incorporate moral standards into his life, and that is the moral standards of his parents and his community. And it holds up a shining model of self, of what we should be. And so it's there giving judgments of what's right and what's wrong. And so there's a constant conflict going on, as we can see here in the slide, between these three And so that, as we see throughout the psychodynamic perspective, each theory has that conflict. But Freud believed that the sexual impulses were the central factor of personality development. And he had a theory of psychosexual development, and it had 5 stages. Those 5 stages were oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Oral was the first year of life because at that time, everything that the baby experiences basically is through its mouth. If it'll fit, it goes in the mouth. And so that was the oral stage. Oral activities included, he thought, sexual gratification and nourishment. So to him, the baby wasn't just getting nourished, there was a sexual gratification that was coming from the oral, using its mouth. And he also believed that in any one of these stages, that any insufficient or excessive gratification could cause a fixation in that stage. And that fixation would cause the person to develop certain traits and characteristics of that stage. And so the oral traits that could be caused by fixation are dependency, gullibility, excessive optimism, and pessimism. The second stage was anal, and that came in the 2nd year of life. And that was gratification that was attained through the contraction and the relaxation in the muscles that control the elimination of waste. He said that they learned to delay gratification that come from that elimination. And the anal fixations are anal retentive, and which are excessive self-control and neatness and cleanliness. I have people at work who are that way. And then there are anal expulsive, which are carelessness and messiness. I would probably fall into that category more easily. I have people, somebody has a place for everything and everything in its place, could be the anal retentive. That is not me. The 3rd year is the phallic phase, and children may develop strong sexual attachments to the parent of the opposite gender in this stage. And they will also begin to view the parent of the same gender as a rival. And sexual feelings towards the parent of the opposite gender are repressed for several years, and they reemerge and then are transferred to a socially appropriate member of the other gender. The next stage is latency, which is reached around age 5 or 6, and all sexual feelings remain unconscious, and they prefer to have playmates of the same gender during this period. The last period is the genital phase, and it's reached at puberty. That's when the sexual urges then for the opposite gender or parent return. And because of the incest taboo, those urges are displaced upon somebody appropriate of the opposite gender, whether it be adult or adolescent. And boys may seek girls that remind them of their mom, and girls are going to seek guys that remind them of their dad. And that's a lot of times. Then we have the Neo-Freudians, who had theories that included conflict and defense mechanisms like Freud, but in other respects their theories differ considerably. Carl Jung had a theory called analytical psychology theory, and it downplayed the role of sex. And you're going to notice that with all these Neo-Freudians, they're all going to downplay the role of sex. They thought Freud put too much emphasis upon sex. And he saw that it was just one of several important instincts. He believed that we have a collective unconsciousness containing archetypes that reflect the history of our species. And some of those archetypes were an all-powerful God, a young hero, a fertile, nurturing mother, the wise old man, the hostile brother, and even themes of rebirth and resurrection. Even though unconscious, he believed that these affected our thoughts and our feelings. Alfred Adler was another neo-Freudian, and he believed that, of course, Freud placed too much emphasis upon sex. He said that people are motivated by an inferiority complex. He said we all experience feelings of being inferior, especially as children, because of our small size, and that gives rise to us drive of superiority. Karen Horney took issue with the psychoanalytical theory of the early 20th century, and that because it taught that women's place was at home. It taught that women who competed with men in the workplace had penis envy. And it also taught that little girls felt inferior to boys because when they found out that boys had penises, they felt inferior because they didn't have one. And so Horney argued that little girls don't feel inferior, and that those views are based upon prejudice of the Western society and not upon scientific evidence. She believed that childhood experiences are important, and however, she asserted that unconscious sexual impulses are less important than social relationships. Erik Erikson believed that Freud put undue emphasis on sex, and like Horney, he believed that social relationships are more important determinants of personality than sexual urges. He believed that we are conscious architects of our own personalities, and that he proposed stages of psychosocial development and named them for traits that might develop during that stage instead of naming them after erogenous zones like Freud had. That moves us on to the trait perspective, and that comes from a notion that we're probably all familiar with, because if you're asked to describe yourself, you're probably going to list traits like you're witty or you're honest or you're loyal. To me, I think of the fruits of the Spirit is what I thought of, which would be traits that we would think of a born-again Christian. Love, joy, peace, those are the traits that we should be portraying. But traits are reasonable, stable elements of personality that are inferred from behavior. And this dates all the way back to the Greek physician Hippocrates, who believed that traits were embedded in bodily fluids, and he called them humors. He believed that a person's personality depended on the balance of these four bodily fluids, which were yellow bile, which would be associated with the choleric, quick-tempered disposition, blood, which would be sanguine, the more cheerful disposition, phlegm, which would be associated with phlegmatic, which would be sluggish disposition, and black bile, which is melancholic, which would be gloomy temperament. And he believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these fluids within the body. And so that he believed in bloodletting or vomiting to bring the fluids back into unison and in balance of where they should be to eliminate the disease. And even though this is not really practiced much anymore, we still hear these terms that he used in psychology when talking about personalities. Hans Eysenk's trait theory focused on the relationship of two personality traits, introversion and extroversion, and emotional stability and instability. And he cataloged these various traits according to where they're situated along the dimension here. In fact, we see here Hippocrates' words are used. And so we can see that a choleric would be an extroverted, and unstable. A sanguine would be extroverted and stable. Extroverted and stable. And so on with the phlegmatic and the melancholic. And so we see how each one, but recent research is suggesting that there are more than two of traits, that there are possibly 5. And that brings us to the theory of the Big Five, or the 5-factor model has been developed. And they include extroversion and emotional instability, but along with it, it includes conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience. And it suggests that the factors are related to people's basic temperaments, which are considered to be inborn. It suggests that our personalities tend to mature over time rather than to be shaped by our environment or environmental conditions. And researchers have also found biological factors that may give rise to personality traits. Researchers estimate that the heritability of the extroverted personality is 40 to 60%. That moves on to the learning perspective. There are a couple of theories in this perspective, but the learning perspectives focus on behaviors instead of traits, and believe that those behaviors are largely learned. In the behaviorism theory, personality is plastic, and that is the situational and environmental influences, not internal individual variables, are key shapers to your personality. John Watson argued that the unseen, undetectable mental structures must be rejected in favor of that which can be seen and measured. B.F. Skinner agreed with Watson and also emphasized the effects of reinforcements upon behavior. They largely ignored the notions of personal freedom and choice. Instead of our wants originating within us, they suggest that influences in like your parental approval or social customs shape us into wanting or not wanting certain things. The social cognitive theory was developed by Albert Bandura, and it focuses on learning by observation and on the cognitive processes that underlie personality differences. It sees people as influencing their environment just as it affects them. And it asserts that a person variables such as knowledge, skills, thank you, and emotions must be considered, not just behavior. And so observational learning, which is the acquiring of knowledge by watching others or observing others, is one of the foundations of this theory. That moves us on to the humanistic existential perspective, and it places self-awareness at the center of consideration and argues that people are capable of free choice, self-fulfillment, and ethical behavior within themselves. In contrast to Freud, Abraham Maslow argued that we are not at the mercy of an unconscious primitive impulses. He said that people have a conscious need for self-actualization, which is to be the best that you can be. And because of that, because people are unique, they each must follow a unique path to that self-actualization. And so each one of us is not going to follow the same path. Carl Rogers' self-theory believed that people shape themselves through free choice and action. It places self at the center of experience. Yourself is your sense of who you are, what you are, your values, your sense of how and why you react with the environment, and how you choose to act upon that environment. And he had two major concerns, which were self-concept and self-esteem. Self-concepts were your impression of yourself and evaluations of your adequacy, and self-esteem, which reflected the esteem in which others hold us. Then we move on to the social cultural perspective, and it shows that different ethnic groups have different attitudes, beliefs, norms, and values. Cross-cultural research reveals that people in the United States and Northern Europe nations tend to be individualists. That is, they define defining itself as in terms of personal identities and giving priorities to personal goals. When asked to complete the statement, I am, they typically respond with terms of personal traits or their occupations. In contrast, people from Africa, Asia, Central, and South America tend to be collectivists. And they define self in terms of the group to which they belong and give priority to group goals. And when asked to complete the statement, I am, they respond with terms of family, gender, or nation. Now, self-esteem is connected with patterns of acculturation among immigrants. Some are completely assimilated by the dominant culture, losing the language and the customs of their country of origin. Others maintain complete separation from the dominant culture, the one they're living in, and do not learn the language. They do not assimilate into their new country, but speak the language and the customs and everything of their old country. Still others become bicultural. In other words, they have the ability to speak both languages. They keep some customs of the old country. They take on customs of the new country where they're living. So they have values from both countries. And research suggests that bicultural people have relatively higher self-esteem than those who completely surrender their traditional backgrounds. Now, since each of these perspectives has some validity, then the answer to about Jane, we should look at all of them. And it could be deducted that Jane may have inherited her extrovert personality from her parents, since there was a 40 to 60% chance of that happening. Also, her environment that she grew up in no doubt had an impact upon her personality. And it could have been pressure to conform to acceptable behavior or a trait present within her from birth.
Thank you very much, Bryan. And like you said, there's all kinds of variables that play into her personality, how she reacts. There's something else I want to consider, and as part of our question, what does the role of religion play? Go ahead and hit the next one. All right. No, before that, sorry. Here we go. Oops. There you go. All right. There was in Tehran, they did a study of 187 students, and they gave them a basic religious beliefs test, and then they gave them the NEO test, personality test, to see where they related, how they felt about religion, and what the correlation was. And they found that people with a strong religious belief had a better outlook on life, just like Jane. You know, they've got that snazzy, go for it attitude. And that's, people around the world have that belief. Everywhere you go, no matter what religion you look at, they all have the same effect. The belief system is there, then the personality is generally a more positive outlook. Oh, you're right. Go back. So, were we created? Was that personality created by God? Our enthusiasm is direct link to our creation in God, from God. And someone that takes on that personality of Jane is Peter. I mean, that dude was on fire. You know, before he met Jesus, he was, you know, fishermen were a rough group of people, and they would go after you like nobody's business. And then whenever they came for Jesus, what did he do? He took out his sword, chopped off the ear of the priest's servant, and he went after him. He wasn't afraid at that point. And he spread the word and he would preach regularly. All right? So did God create our personality, or is it more related to our environment? Well, like he spoke of before, we're created. You know, in Jeremiah, whenever he was a little boy, God told him, you know, when you were young, I knew everything about you before you were even made. I knew what you were going to be. I knew what you were going to do. You know, so he already knew. He created him. All right? In Psalm 139, David talks about, you knit me in my mother's womb. You knew everything about me from that point. And then in Genesis 1:27, we are created in his image. You know, he said, let's make them, and they made them. So God created mankind, his own image. You know, it's time and time again in Spanish. Y crió Dios el hombre en su imagen, y imagen de Dios lo crió, varón y hembra los crió. Genesis 1:27. All right? Creation. Creation. Look, he knew everything about us. Every little bit. Mind, spirit, body. Every little molecule is made from us. Our personality, part of our brain where it releases the chemicals of how we react, God made all that. So, while the environment does play a role in how we react with things, it's not the major component of what happens, because we are created by God. For we are workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Ephesians. All right, got any questions, comments, concerns, viewpoints that you would like to add?
Yeah, that's awesome. I totally agree with that last part, because in the environment I grew up in, I had a good childhood and everything, but if you want to look at it from a different standpoint, like my mother left me, my father left me, you know, and all this, I mean, I could have turned out, you know, way worse than I am now. But, you know, God created me for a purpose. I am the way that I am because I am the way that I am. You know, no matter what from the beginning, even though it did affect me in some ways, and I learned things. You know, I was created from the beginning, and He knew me, He molded me then. So yeah, that's right.
And you know, those things that you went through, you can relate to someone else that's struggling. You know, so they're going through the exact same things you're going through, or that we go through, and we can relate. So everything that happened to us for a reason, so that we can help someone else. Because how do they get to know about Christ? You got to tell them, right? So that's like opens the door to the conversation of that relationship.